My name is Sarit Michaeli. I work for the Israeli organization BTselem, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories. BTselem is one of Israel's most well-known human rights groups. We've been around for over 33 years, monitoring and documenting and advocating to end the whole range of human rights violations related to the occupation and to end the occupation itself. I've been with BTselem for just over 17 years. Most of that period was as the media spokesperson for the organization. I did that for 12 years, and for the past few years, I've been doing something similar, but with the international community, primarily with diplomats and with international civil society. So working in an Israeli human rights organization in this day and age is a little bit contradictory, because I think, let me look at the positive side first. We still have a very, very strong, vibrant, proud Israeli civil society, which is comprised of very self-critical organizations that are doing amazing work, that I'm really proud to call them my colleagues and my friends. And we can still make our voices heard, we can still do our work, and we can still try and describe reality as we see it, the reality on the ground of occupation and of apartheid. But then on the other hand, there's this kind of other part of the picture, which is that we are one of the sectors that is most attacked and criticized and smeared by our own government very often, certainly by groups that make it their business to try and discredit us and to try and silence us. So often there's this feeling that we have we have a lot of ability to say what we think, but the number of Israelis who are actually listening to us, who either think that we're credible enough to listen to, or that it's important to accept what we're saying, is very low, I think, these days, unfortunately. That's not to say that we do not have any public support. There are, I would say, at least hundreds of thousands of Israelis who believe that it's important to have this type of self-criticism, like what BTselem does. We're not a political party, so obviously we don't need those people to vote for us, but we do get a lot of emails and letters of support. We get a lot of donations from Israelis, very often very small individual donations, but they matter a lot to us because they reflect, that all of those people share our values. So it can be a little bit difficult, and I think challenging, because Israel, at least I think for privileged Jewish Israelis like myself, can be a place where you can do a lot of work to, oppose, to criticize your government's policies without having to suffer a massive personal cost impact. This is not necessarily the case for Palestinian human rights defenders. And as Israelis, we try and utilize these privileges, right, to work with these privileges, I should say as Israeli Jews, to try and kind of resist this regime. I should also say that BTselem is an Israeli organization, but does not only have Jewish staffers. We have Palestinian staffers, and we have the whole gamut of religions in our staff. Palestinians and Israelis, Jews and Arabs, Jews, Muslims and Christians. So we, I think, on a personal level, I think one of the real benefits, privileges of working for this kind of organization is also the ability to get to know how the other half lives, basically. And I think that my understanding of what Palestinians go through, what they have to deal with in their lives under Israel's occupation, is much more deep and detailed and expansive than virtually any other Israeli. And I think this gives me a lot of privilege, as well as a responsibility to do all I can in order to change this reality. The terror designation of 6 Palestinian human rights and civil society groups was one of the most extreme and egregious steps that the Israeli authorities have taken in many years. It was quite shocking, I think, to many of us, and really incongruous on some levels, to think that a minister of defense will take this kind of step. And I think one of the assessments was that if this would have happened under the previous government, right, under the Netanyahu government, the international community would have been far more willing to confront this designation head on. I should mention that the international community has not accepted the Israeli information, right, so-called evidence backing this designation. The European Union and its member states announced very clearly that they did not find that Israel substantiated these accusations with the information that it provided. But it's really quite a shocking reality to live in, but it's not surprising. And I'll explain why. Because Israel has designated as terror groups many organizations through similar processes in the past, except for these were Islamic charities, and they were designated on the basis of claims that they are supporting Hamas. When it comes to civil society organizations that are well known internationally, that are many of them, or at least the membership is secular and progressive, this came as a massive shock, but essentially this is the same thing. Israel has attacked these organizations and others on the basis of flimsy claims, primarily based on guilt by association, or kind of like conflating political affiliations with terrorism. For many years. This is done both like officially and unofficially for many years. I should also mention that Israel has already arrested and charged a humanitarian worker from Gaza 5 years ago with diversion of aid in a prosecution that appears to be one of the grossest miscarriages of justice. He's still under arrest and his trial is still ongoing for 5 years. And I should also mention that Israel regularly holds Palestinians as administrative detainees on the basis of secret evidence. So basically making an administrative decision to arrest a person, to deny them freedom on the basis of secret so-called evidence, right? We don't know, we haven't seen it, and no one will see it except for the state and occasionally the judges, without an actual real court case. So it's a very similar process. So, and I think when you look at this process or when you look at the designation of the Palestinian, 6 Palestinian organizations, with this backdrop of like long-term Israeli attacks against Palestinian civil society and smear campaigns and attempts to describe them as terrorists, and also attempts to describe other activities that Palestinian civil society promotes, like, for example, BDS, or reaching out to the ICC, promoting proceedings against Israeli decision makers in the ICC as terror acts as well. I should also say that the law that Israel used to designate these Palestinian organizations as terror groups has been condemned when it was legislated in 2016 by Israeli civil rights groups as extremely broad and general. The terror definition is very broad and almost all-encompassing, and certainly at the time all of these criticisms were made when it was legislated. Now we're simply seeing this being enacted. So it's not the only place in the world where anti-terror legislation is being misused in order to silence criticism, right? In order to silence groups that are critical of a certain regime. But Israel claims to be a democracy. And this is a clear demonstration of the lengths it's willing to go to silence Palestinian organizations that do either extremely important humanitarian work in the health sector and in the agricultural sector, or very, very essential human rights work, for example, providing prisoners with legal representation, providing Palestinian minors in military court with legal representations, or like the example of Al-Haq, working tirelessly to criticize the Israeli occupation and apartheid regime, also to criticize the Palestinian Authority, by the way, and also to promote cases against Israel for crimes in the ICC. So this is very clearly a shocking attempt to silence criticism. And the problem is that, as I said, suddenly the countries, primarily from the European Union, that donate to these organizations have clarified that they will continue to support these organizations. But I think for as long as this is being allowed to continue in this way, the chilling effect is already in place, and the impact on these organizations, like, for example, through the banking sector, could be, could exacerbate, because this essentially means, that the terror designation essentially means that Israel will be able to arrest these organizations, raid their offices, seize their assets, stop any kind of funds from being transferred to them through banks. So all of this, and this is everyone, the most observers agree that this was the intention, right? That Israel wants to shut down these organizations. So about a year ago, BTselem issued a position paper that reframes or describes the reality on the ground as we see it between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea, so our entire region, as an apartheid regime. In the position paper we publicized, we give examples, or at first we discuss the underlying principle of this regime, right? A regime of Jewish supremacy. This is the principle that Israel applies through different policies and practices in various ways throughout the region. So not every single fragment of the region is treated identically, but the overarching principle of Jewish supremacy is applied everywhere. And this principle is enacted through four broad avenues. The first is land takeovers. The second is residency and citizenship. The third is freedom of movement. And the fourth is political participation. And we show in our position paper, which is a short paper, it's not a very, very detailed legal document. It's a relatively short position paper. We show how these kind of like principles are applied throughout the region. So both on Palestinians living in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, as well as to the Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip, and Palestinians living inside Israel proper, right? Israel's sovereign territory. And we show how these similar principles are applied to, as I said, to promote the overarching goal of establishing Jewish supremacy. And then essentially BTselem, acknowledged, right, that this is a novel approach for us, right? We changed the way we describe reality. BTselem clarified that we are not the first to say this, right? An Israeli organization called Yesh Din, colleagues of ours, issued a very detailed legal brief on the crime of apartheid in the occupied West Bank, and certainly Palestinian activist organizations and others have been putting out this information and describing the situation in our region as apartheid for long before we started doing it. But it still was quite an important step for BTselem to take, and we explain also why we had to update our assessment of reality. Several things were explained in our position paper as to why we decided that the time has come to begin to utilize this terminology of apartheid. And I think the clearest was the Jewish nation state law that was enacted, that was legislated in 2018, and also the entire conversation around the de jure annexation of the West Bank that Israel had planned. I think basically the essential thing we're saying in this position paper is that it's simply impossible to continue to look at the reality on the ground in our area as a kind of military occupation over the Green Line, so in the occupied territories, and a democracy inside Israel. This is simply no longer a realistic way to describe what we live through. And we have to begin to use language that will be more accurate and describe reality more accurately, even though this is language that some people find very difficult, provocative, hard. But we think it's our obligation as human rights defenders to basically to speak truth to power. Now, I should clarify that when we use the term apartheid in our report, we clarify that we're not talking about an exact historical allusion to South Africa, right? That's not what we're talking about. What we are talking about is an internationally recognized crime. Since BTselem issued the report, our position paper, both Human Rights Watch and Amnesty have issued very, very detailed, long legal analysis of the crime of apartheid in the context of our region. And in fact, I just watched a presentation of the UN Special Rapporteur on the Palestinian people, Michaeli, in which he as well took up the description, the term apartheid, and utilized it in a report that will be published in the near future. So I think within our community now of Palestinian, Israeli, and international human rights organizations, there is quite a broad consensus, although it differs in terms of the kind of the specific aspects of it, that this description, right, that this international crime is being perpetrated in our region, and that there needs to be a willingness of the international community to accept that, to acknowledge reality, and to work to change it. We thought long and hard before we issued the report. We planned, we considered, we assumed there'll be a backlash. And I have to say there was less of a backlash than we anticipated. This is how I see it. I think this is primarily because when BTselem issued its report, the Israeli government just felt like it was the previous government, the Netanyahu government, and I think it felt like it could just ignore us, and possibly that was correct. I think there was a lot of international media coverage of our position paper, our statements. I think it meant a lot to people around the world that one of the most respected and credible Israeli organizations, if I blow our own collective horn here, said this, right, made this statement, took this step. But I think that inside Israel now, the kind of divide is so clear. People have either accepted or not accepted, or people either kind of accept this reality or just deny it. And it seems quite unlikely for people to be like kind of really dragged into a massive debate. This was when BTselem issued its own position paper. That was our sense. It felt like the government didn't really feel like it had to make a massive effort. Another issue, and I think this is my personal perspective, right? I think that in our region, so many people, including a lot of prominent Israelis, including very mainstream Israelis, have already used the term apartheid. Most of them, have to say, we're using it to describe like a potential future situation that will happen if and when something happens, like if we don't, have negotiations for a two-state solution, or, you know what I mean. But I think generally speaking, the option of apartheid and the word has been on the table for a long time. Thirdly, I think if you look at public opinion research inside Israel, aside from the word itself being quite unpalatable, many Israelis support the current reality, which is that Israeli Jews are privileged, and are privileged legally in terms of their access to rights. The state defines itself as a Jewish state in its basic law of 2018, and Palestinians are relegated to various levels of discrimination and lack of rights, right? Obviously, through the fragmentation of space and through the different citizenship and residency and status options that they're offered by Israel, but ultimately they can never reach the privileged status of an Israeli Jew like myself. This is already the situation, and a lot of people are okay with this. So I think we're, people are upset, and some people are upset by the use of the term apartheid, but far fewer people in Israel, I think, are upset by the reality of this kind of, intense systemic racial subjugation or racial national subjugation of Palestinians by Jews. And I think that this changed, though, when Amnesty International issued their report, and I think also when Human Rights Watch issued their report, and is the Israeli government certainly tried its best to discredit, to attack, to try and accuse Amnesty of antisemitism, as it always inadvertently does whenever criticism is launched. Certainly, I think the previous government, the Bibi government, did that across the board, right? Literally every criticism of Israeli government policy was framed as anti-Semitism. I think the new government we have is slightly different, and it's a more nuanced approach. We ought to be fair about it. And our Minister of Foreign Affairs, Yair Lapid, said that not all criticism is anti-Semitism, but in this particular case, when it came to the Amnesty report accusing Israel of perpetuating an apartheid regime, that was that was the kind of the knee-jerk reaction of the Israeli government. I think for me, one of the most important and fulfilling aspects of my job is the ability to go to the field, to meet with Palestinians, with communities, with families who are dealing with this, reality, to listen to them, to really actually listen to them, and to also, as to the best of my ability, also to use my privileges, my access, my skills, my experience to facilitate meetings between them and in the international community. And to do it also from the perspective of an Israeli organization, right? Because I think the era when Palestinians, relied on foreigners, Israelis, internationals, to kind of like make their voice heard is long gone, right? This is simply not the case these days. Palestinians are, speaking out, and they don't need There's no need for us. But I think we, as an Israeli organization, and we as Israelis have an obligation from the perspective of the occupier to come and to do what we can in order to describe to the world what is going on the ground, and to show the international community and Israelis, the vast majority of the work that BTselem does is actually with Israeli audiences, right? Everything we say and do is written in Hebrew. We write many op-eds, we meet people, we discuss it, we do media, and also with the international community. And so for me, really, in a way, I think those experiences of like being on the ground, talking to people, listening to them, understanding what they're actually going through, and then also again, like with from the specific perspective I have of being in an Israeli human rights organization, also explaining this and contextualizing this, it's something that I find to be a massive privilege. And I think the fact that so many of our colleagues, our Palestinian colleagues and our Palestinian volunteers, BTselem has a video project where we distribute video cameras to Palestinians living in these high friction areas throughout the West Bank. The fact that we can do this work together, I think for me is really very, very valuable. And it's also not, it's not a given that they would want to work with us, right? There's a whole range of reasons why people on the ground would be mistrusting and suspicious. So for me, I think this is really the essential thing, and I'm like being able to kind of collectively or together express people's realities and what they have to deal with, and also not just kind of individual stories, but the systemic natures of this. The fact that this is not about an individual family that is just suffering, or an individual person who did something wrong. It's about policies, and these policies have objectives, and these objectives are, I find, as an Israeli, as a Jew, I find absolutely unacceptable, and I reject them, and I try and do my best within my power to speak out against them. So trying to kind of explain the systemic nature of everything we see on the ground is, for me, the most and linking that also with individual communities and people and their stories is the most really the most important part of my work.